Deplorable Luncheon.
Hey!
The first of many, every month, first Tuesday of the month, we will have a different deplorable speaking at our Deplorable Lunch. I'm Anthony Capella from Concord Publishing. For those who don't know me, welcome to our book room. This is going to be the Centre for Right Thinking, and one of our many exciting events, along with LibertyWorks, is our Deplorable Luncheon. And our first deplorable speaker, of course, is no other than James Allan, who's published 2 books with us. Democracy in Decline, which is available here today, which Jim will actually sign copies of, and Making Australia Right, which was launched by Tony Abbott earlier this year, which caused a storm because for the first time Abbott had some direction where we were going to go. So the format of today will be that Jim will speak for about half an hour, and then I will hand it over to Andrew Cooper from LibertyWorks, who will facilitate a sort of a round table, square table, rectangular table discussion. And then that will finish by, we'll get out of here by 2 o'clock, time to buy a copy of the book, all the books are sold by the way, and have it signed. So there's plenty of wine, there's plenty of sandwiches, there's coffee in the kitchen, so please make yourselves at home, and I will now call in about 5 minutes Jim Allan to come and speak about being a deplorable. Thank you.
And Connor Court Press, Andrew and Anthony, for having invited me here today. I guess in one sense this is an AA meeting. I'm pretty sure some of you have been to the other sort of AA meeting, but so this is the first ever inaugural Deplorables Lunch, and I think it's only fair to remind all of you of the genealogy of that term. So in September of last year, so there were fewer than 60 days to go to the presidential election, the Democratic presidential nominee, Hillary Clinton, was addressing a fundraiser. Not just any fundraiser, it was an LGBT fundraiser. I think they only had 4 letters back then. After the usual dose of identity politics, which means on steroids, Hillary turned to comment on those people who are going to vote for Trump. So let me now quote from her speech. To just be grossly generalistic, you could put half of Trump's supporters into what I call the basket of deplorables, right? The racist, sexist, homophobic, xenophobic, Islamophobic, you name it, and he has lifted them up. Now, some of these folks, they are irredeemable, but thankfully they're not America. So you got that? Trump is racist, sexist, homophobic, xenophobic, and Islamophobic. Now, you know, those are the reasons I wouldn't vote for him. I don't think they're why everyone voted for him. And this deplorable, remember, comes from a woman who poured metaphorical IT bleach into her hard drive to wipe out any trace of emails that quite plausibly could have landed her in prison. It's a woman who, with her husband, has earned tens and tens and tens, keep saying that, of millions of dollars through the Clinton Foundation with its money or cash for access. It's a woman who was culpable in the aftermath of the Benghazi affair, whose husband Bill met up with the then sitting Attorney General Loretta Lynch for a meeting, an informal one, you understand, because if you had had a formal meeting like that during the election campaign, improper would have been the least of it. A woman who was then part of the Iran deal making, and the list goes on. So this is the person with those sort of moral credentials who's accusing half of Americans, so a quarter of all Americans, of being deplorable. Figure it goes without saying it wasn't her finest moment as a politician. But the fact that she could say it knowing it was being recorded indicates not only that she really believes that about 50 million of her fellow citizens, that's what she thinks of them, but rather, this is the incredible part, she didn't think it would hurt her campaign. At any rate, many people now wear the deplorables as a sort of badge of honor. It's a bit, I think, I used to live in Hong Kong, and it's a bit the way Caucasians in Hong Kong, the locals would call them guilos, it means white devils, but the Westerners used to use it to describe themselves. So, you know, it's a sort of badge of honor. So I think you can think of the label deplorables that way. It's a sign that you don't see yourself as part of the Washington, New York, Hollywood, media, show business, public servant cabal. Or if you translate that to Australia, then you don't see yourself as part of the ABC, Renewable Energy Rent-Seeking, Human Rights Commission, big immigration, big government cabal. So wear it with pride. And with that preamble of the way, let me thank you for coming to the first ever Deplorables Lunch. I'm going to talk about two things today that gave rise to us deplorables, namely the Brexit referendum and then Mr. Trump's election win. And I'm going to finish with a little depressing comparison of the Trump and Turnbull administrations. It's not going to be good for Mr. Turnbull. So let me start with Brexit, which is still topical and relevant. In the UK, they have this publication called the Times Higher Education Journal. It's like the Bible for academics. And before the Brexit referendum, they conducted a survey. They found that 90% of those working in UK universities were going to vote Remain in the EU referendum. So 9 out of 10 UK academics were, and still are, I think, for the supranationalism that basically undercuts democracy and democratic decision-making, which is a pretty big imbalance when you remember that 52% of Brits voted Leave. That same Times Higher Education survey showed that 40% of respondents said that they would be more likely to leave the UK themselves, to emigrate if Leave won. This is the typical posturing, and I call it cheap bumper sticker moralizing, virtue signaling, and betraying the fact that basically you think you're morally superior to the people you disagree with. And you've been seen in the UK by many on the Remain side since the results. Personally, I had too much to drink when I found out about the referendum. Best vote of my life. Theresa May is doing what she can to wreck it, but for what it's worth, basically no one has left the UK who said they were going to leave if the vote went against them. What a stunning revelation. But here's a related story. It's a favorite of mine. There was a Cambridge University academic. Her name was Victoria Bateman. And she was so distraught by all the ill-informed, know-nothing, nativist, racist, small Englanders who voted Leave, because she's an academic, and in her view, no one could possibly vote out of the EU unless, if she were nice or he were nice or intelligent or well-informed. It's not possible. So she was so distraught that she went to her first, this is true, her first post-Brexit faculty of economics meeting at Cambridge, and she went and she showed up naked, no clothes. She'd written on her breast and stomach, "Brexit leaves Britain naked." Now, look, I can't speak for everyone, but I think we need more protesters like Victoria Bateman. And not just because from some of the reports and photos she's, quite a good-looking woman, but it seems to me that if you're going to be condescending and dismissive and at core opposed to democracy and democratic decision-making, then at the very least you should be someone who protests by showing up naked. So if any of you are looking to hire an academic economist, let me take this opportunity to throw Victoria Bateman's name in the ring. This woman is not only ambitious, she is nakedly ambitious. But of course the larger point is just how smug and holier than thou these people are. And after working 12 years in Australian university, it's pretty much the same in my view here. I would say 9 out of 10 academics would be on the pro-EU Remain side, with its sort of democracy-enervating foundations, its love of uber-powerful judges, its embrace of international law. And international law, let me tell you, varies between not having a single democratic bone in its body, that's international customary law, and being very democratically deficient. That's more democratic side, and that's treaties and conventions. And there's the fondness for supranational bodies like the United Nations and all the myriad committees chaired by, Saudi Arabia and Libya. And, you'll know that the UN has made more resolutions that say that Israel is not rights respecting than every other country on earth. So if you want to find a place where women's rights are really being hammered, you have to go to Israel. Not Somalia, not Saudi Arabia where women can't drive. Israel. It's just laughable. EU, by the way, is the only part of the globe in recent years that has experienced zero economic growth. But let me just complete the rest of my argument, because I just want to show you why I think Australian academics lean massively to the left. Because there were people in the UK who voted Remain who were on the right side, but a lot more Labour voters voted for Remain in percentage terms, at least according to the exit polls. So I want to give you some reasons to think Australian academics skew left. You already know this, but And I think they do so even more than those who work at our billion-dollar-a-year national broadcaster, the ABC, our ABC that they call themselves. But despite its, I think it's $1.2 billion a year budget, when you look at its main television current affairs shows, you cannot find a single solitary, not one, presenter, producer, or top person with a right of center background. So zip, zero, nada, not one. It's a tiny bit better on radio because you can maybe count two. Tom Switzer for sure, he's an odd kind of righty, but he's definitely right. He's sort of like Paul Ryan type. And some people count Amanda Vanstone as a conservative.
No.
Hard argument to make, really. The former ABC Managing Director, Mark Scott, his usual and often repeated response to this obvious and undeniable lack of balance, which on any straightforward reading breaches its charter. But Scott was, he'd like to say that he said, his response was to say that all of his top-class journalists would look inside themselves and they would do their best to be impartial and disinterested. Can you imagine how that sort of, I've looked inside myself, and despite being a former Labour Party speechwriter, Labour Party working for Gough Whitlam, I can assure you that I'm impartial. Can you imagine how that would be received if every single top person on these TV current affairs shows were from the right side of politics? They would be going crazy. There'd be protests galore. Now, on the upside, some of those protesting might adopt Dr. Bateman's strategy, but still, there'd be protests galore. Basically, they would stand for it on the left. Or imagine if every single top person at the ABC on all of their news and everything were a man. Not unreasonably, some women might complain. Can you imagine Mark Scott brushing them off with an insouciant wave of the hand, with assurances that, all my male employees, they look inside themselves and they do their very best to give the watchers a female take on things as much as a male. Because that's exactly what the assurances we get from the ABC boil down to as right of center people. The only diversity you get at the ABC is the sort that focuses on skin pigmentation and the sort of reproductive organs you have. And that's it. There's never a diversity of ideas, political viewpoints. You never see the ABC aiming for a diversity of people on both sides of the small government, big government divide, Hobbesian versus internationalist, judges versus parliament, or even left versus right. We're just told we don't have to worry about it because these top-class ABC journalists are wholly balanced and impartial. And what has the Turnbull response to this undeniable lack of balance in the ABC been? Well, he appointed see no bias Michelle Guthrie as the new CEO, and hear no bias Justin Milne as the chair of the ABC board. Both would have been totally solid Labour picks. There's only one word for Turnbull's appointments, so you might as well say it with me: deplorable. On that theme, it's Team Turnbull that appointed Ed Santow to the Human Rights Commission. This is the most astounding thing. This is a guy who's so culturally left, even, and I mean this literally, Labour wouldn't have appointed him, he's so far left. This guy, Santow, whom I used to debate about Bills of Rights, he didn't say one word, not a peep, in defense of Bill Leak or the three QUT students, even though Brandis and Turnbull had appointed him as the Human Rights Commission's Freedom Commissioner. It's astounding. So again, I think you know the word for that sort of pathetic Liberal Party appointment: deplorable. And then there's the appalling Gillian Triggs. As her term as president of the Human Rights Commission comes to an end, does Team Turnbull try to close down the HRC? Of course not. Does Turnbull at least appoint a new president who has a soupçon of rightist interviews and might rein in the worst excess of the HRC? Of course not. No, it's Rosalind Croucher. Bill Shorten or the Greens could have appointed her. What's the word I'm looking for? Deplorable. And the same goes for almost all of the Libs judicial picks, with one exception of the High Court. Just, what is wrong with Liberal parties? Even at the state level, they don't seem to be able to appoint any people who vote for them. It's the same at our universities. Actually, it's probably worse. A few years ago, there was an American professor named John McGinnis, and he and a colleague of his looked at political donations in the U.S. because it's public information if you give money to the party there. He looked at law school professors at the Ivy League, and donations ran at over 6-1 to the Democrats. So, and you have to notice that this 6-1 slant only measures people who give money to political parties. If you assume, plausibly, that Republicans are more likely to give the Democrats, then the bias is even worse. And it only looks at the most elite law schools in the US. So many suppose that the bias or imbalance would be worse, and by worse I mean the percentage of conservatives would be lower, which is not what left-wing academics mean by worse, but it's worse in lesser law schools, because if you're going to tough it out as a Tory, Republican, raving right-winger, that's the accepted academic mot juste, you're more likely to do it at Harvard or Yale than you are, the University of Arkansas or Vermont or Hawaii. Amy Wax, who's a very good American law prof, she was reviewing Charles Murray's book, Becoming a Part of White America, and she describes the vast preponderance of US academics, almost all of them, she says, having progressive and liberal commitments. And this is law. So you have to bear in mind that the ratio and numbers of conservatives to lefties will be much lower in some disciplines compared to in law. Think gender studies departments, or Aboriginal studies departments, and much of the social sciences. And of course, depending on how you classify economics, because the way Professor Victoria Bateman at Cambridge practices economics, it's more of a branch of the fine arts. She's wandering naked, but or take political science departments. Or I like this one, social psychologist. Jonathan Haidt in the U.S. He's a sort of centrist lefty, but he's very unhappy with these results. He does not like what's happened to universities. His data, he's polled social psychologists in all American universities. I'm not making these numbers up. 96% see themselves as left of center. 3.7% see themselves as centrist, and wait for it, 0.3% see themselves as right of center. Basically, negligible. It's like spotting a dodo bird. So, with a bit of poetic license, I think that universities might just make the ABC look more balanced. And it's only because there's basically so much of a problem in our universities. Now, that's just the US. Some people might go, oh, Australia is a beacon of balance and impartiality compared to the US. I don't think so after 12 years working in this country. A 6-to-1 Labour to Liberal, or Greens Labour to Liberal National split would mean that at my university, a law school, where there's about 40 law academics, you'd need to find 6 coalition voters. 3 years ago, you could have done it at UQ Law School, just. We've had a couple of retirements. Now I'm not so sure, maybe. But just to put this in context for you, the UQ Law School where I work is widely perceived to be the most right-wing law school in Australia. One Melbourne legal academic, again I'm not making this up, describes UQ as the raving right-wing law school. So just to be perfectly clear, that's the label a law school gets in this country, being the country's bastion of right-winger, on the basis that for every 1 coalition voter in the faculty, there are 6 lefty voters. So a faculty comprised of 14% righties is ravingly right-wing. By the way, my own personal belief is that 6-to-1 ratio would be worse at every other big law school in this country. Possibly there's a few country law schools, but there'll be the odd tax legal academic here who will vote for the coalition in the secrecy of the ballot box, but that's about it. And in public law, where I work, where you deal with Constitution, stopping the boats. How many legal academics in this country want to stop the boats? Maybe 3. Getting a Bill of Rights, I'm against it. Most people are for it. Any right of center views are almost very hard to find. But just rest comfortably, because no doubt all these lefty professors who are teaching your kids at university are following Mark Scott's advice when he talked about the ABC, and they're looking inside themselves, and we all know they're presenting their political science lectures in a wholly impartial, balanced, neutral way, just like the ABC current affairs shows. Well, at least it's not your tax dollars paying for the ABC. Oh, hang on a second. It is. What's the word for that?
Deplorable.
And by the way, the whole rise of identity politics and political correctness and safe spaces favors this one-sidedness at the university, the ABC. It makes it easier for them to push their just all left-wing agendas. I think I'd unduly depress you if I told you how in our university stays there are these big bureaucracies, highly paid bureaucracies, explicitly devoted to diversity and equity. They pay a Human Rights Commission to run a survey that, I've had epidemiologists email me. worthless. Everything that I said was totally meaningless data, but they paid $1 million for it. You know, and they defined sexual harassment by looking at somebody. I'm not sure how the species is supposed to reproduce if you're not allowed to look at somebody. Surely that doesn't count as sexual harassment. Of course, it was not even random survey. People could answer if they want. They got under 10%. Quite a famous world epidemiologist has emailed me and said, the data is worthless, completely worthless. But it's that sort of thing that leads to what you see at QUT, where Caucasian students can't use the empty computer terminals. And this supposedly liberal coalition government team term, what does it do? It does nothing. They're just cowards, they're pusillanimous. So that's Brexit. I've covered a fair bit of ground just from that starting point. But the basic truth you can take from that result was that the average voter ignored the preferences and druthers of those who see themselves as being better educated, smarter, more selfless, better placed to make decisions for society, and 52% voted Leave. As I said, it was pretty much the best vote of my life. Theresa May is screwing it up, but I still think it'll go ahead. And that was a wonderful vote. Second big event that led to the deplorables was the election of Donald Trump. Now, I've made lots of bad predictions in my life, but by some cosmic fluke, I predicted both Brexit and Trump in print before they happened. So I should have won the lottery. So Trump's win, though, was more unlikely. And partly, I think, it's because the man is such an imperfect messenger. Let's face it, he's vulgar, he's crass. Worse than that, for most of his life, he's been a Democrat. He's not all that articulate. Although few people know that he did quite well at the very highly ranked Wharton Business School when he got his MBA. While, for comparison's sake, Canada's Trust Fund Prime Minister Justin Trudeau did not finish his master's degree in, environmental geography. And Mr. Trudeau had no serious career before politics, just the name recognition, lots of money. Certainly nothing comparable to being a property magnate before taking the top job. Social media loves Mr. Trudeau. But returning to Trump, one of his great virtues, I think, is that he called out the lack of fight in so many Republicans. I mean, why go into politics if you don't want to win and you don't want to change the world? Their lack of desire to stand up against, too much immigration, or the massive left-leaning bias of the media, the idiotic ineffectiveness and virtue signaling in so many of the Obama energy policies that led up to the Paris Accords that will do nothing to change the temperature. The sanctimonious lefty preachiness of Hollywood, and even sports broadcasting like ESPN, which is bleeding viewers and mostly Republicans, because they've stopped just talking about sports and now they want to talk about politics from the left of Hillary perspective, and then they wonder why Republicans don't want to pay for ESPN anymore. So in brief, Mr. Trump came as close as anyone to representing a spectrum of positions that Hillary Clinton described in a roundabout way as deplorable. But when you actually look at them one by, they don't seem that deplorable. But it's pretty clear that Trump's win was considered extremely undesirable. What's the word I'm looking for here?
Deplorable.
To Malcolm Turnbull. I don't know how many of you remember that look on Malcolm's face the morning Trump's win was officially declared. He looked aghast. And Julie Bishop, heck, most of the 54 defenestrating bedwetters seemed a lot more comfortable as Hillary supporters than as Trumpists. And then there's the preponderance of op-ed writers for The Australian. This is the right-wing newspaper in this country. Paul Kelly got Brexit and Trump wrong, and he continues to lament the latter to this day. Nikki Sava, when she's not blaming Tony Abbott for everything under the sun, that she pretty much leaves no time at all for her, but and she never mentions the fact that her husband works for Turnbull but had been gotten rid of by Abbott. So you would have thought that journalistic ethics would require that statement at the top of every column of hers, but it's pretty clear she doesn't like Trump. I can't recall the last time Peter Van Onselen got anything right, and I mean that literally. He got Brexit wrong, Trump wrong. I remember in print when he said Gillard was going to be a really good prime minister and a fantastic role model to his daughter. He thought Turnbull would be fantastic. He said Abbott would never win an election. He said the boats could not be stopped. It wasn't possible. He said an ETS had to be agreed to or the Libs would implode. That was just before Abbott took over the party and won an election. And he has continually been urging the Libs to break their same-sex plebiscite promise. The list goes on. And with that sort of track record in any other line of work, I figured he'd be fired. How could you keep your job? But the point here is he got Trump and Brexit wrong. Even Greg Sheridan, whom I like, got them both wrong, especially Trump. And meanwhile, you see the United States U.S. Study Center at the University of Sydney, the center that John Howard made sure had lots of money to start up. And people said to him, Mr. Howard, if you give money to an Australian university, it becomes left the minute the money arrives at the door. Didn't believe it. Well, that has some 28 or 29 legal or academics working there now, supposed experts on the U.S. 29, not a single one picked Trump to win. Not a single one supported Trump to win, or even come close to winning. It is more left-leaning than the political studies department. And this was all money that was provided by a right-of-center Howard government. He's now, Mr. Howard, giving money to the UNSW for this latest Ramsey Center. It's not going to work. I think he's still, I think many people in this country remember back to when they were in university and the 70s where there was at least a modicum of balance. But Donald Trump's win has basically driven the chattering Chardonnay sipping classes crazy in this country. And in part that's because they too believe, I think deep down they believe, that Trump voters are deplorable. And to repeat, even many liberals in this country think that. They think anyone who voted for Trump must be deplorable. Even, and I'm including a fair few liberal MPs, a fair few business people, think tank types on the right, you name it. So let me just then finish with a little comparison of the Trump and Turnbull administrations. So I'm going to run through a list of policies and compare Team Turnbull, that's the new official name for the Liberal Party, not many people know that, and the deplorable Mr. Trump. And then you can decide for yourself after we go through each criterion which administration is actually the deplorable one. So A, firstly, since Trump has been elected, the US debt has actually gone down. I don't mean that the rate of increase of the deficit has declined, I mean the debt has gone down. Not very much, tiny little bit. Here in Australia, Team Turnbull has produced no plausible path to surplus. We can't even get out of deficit. Not unless you believe in fairies, anyway. And I mean the FAIR kind, not the kind they're discussing in Canberra right now. Team Turnbull is happy with a reduction in the rate of increase of the deficit. So they brag about the fact that the rate of increase of the deficit is going down. So it's still going up, but it's not going up as much as it was going up. And they do that together with making a few heroic assumptions about future growth. This is the Wayne Swan school of predicting the surplus. So what you do is you assume that growth is going to be 1 billion%. And hey, we've gotten rid of the deficit. We'll make the deficit supposedly disappear one day. So Trump Turnbull, one of those is deplorable. Secondly, Mr. Trump nominated an interpretively conservative person to the Supreme Court, Neil Gorsuch, and then got him confirmed. He has produced a list, Trump, and promised that all of his appointments will be from that list. They are all fantastic, right-of-center, interpretively conservative, non-judicial activists. Brandis and Trump and Abbott, too, have made appointments to our court that could all, save for one, have been made by Labour. Only one, the first Abbott pick was okay, but they picked a guy who's 65, who's only got a few years on the court. Did they pick a Callanan? Did they pick a Dyson Hayden? No, they did not. They basically picked judges that Labour could have picked. And in fact, the best judge on the High Court right now is a Labour appointee. How embarrassing is that? So basically, the judicial picks by the Libs have been a disgrace. Likewise, Trump is appointing solid right-of-center people to administrative bodies. You've got a global warming skeptic at the EPA. You've got a really blunt-talking UN skeptic, a woman who used to be the governor of, I forget, where was Haley? South Carolina, as the ambassador to the UN. Remember, she goes into the UN and says the UN is a disgrace. It is a disgrace. It's fantastic. Here we have Turnbull's appointing Santow and Khrushchev to the Human Rights Commission. Well, one of those is a deplorable and one isn't. Thirdly, Mr. Trump pulled out of the Paris Accord, which is costing tons of money, which is virtue signaling, and it is doing nothing. It is not. When you ask these people, what effect will it have on the temperature in the year 2100, the answer is nothing. You know, so why are we doing it? Well, we're a moral exemplar, showing India and China the way forward. Nobody in India or China cares what we're doing. Turnbull has stayed in the Paris Accords and he's throwing more money at it. Well, one of those is deplorable. Fourthly, Trump has quietly been cutting regulations to an amazing extent. We were doing that here until the defenestration of Abbott. Team Turnbull stopped the day after the coup, so we're not doing it anymore. Right. Another one of those is deplorable. Fifth, Mr. Trump has been incredibly successful so far in giving a green light to increased energy production. The Americans are going crazy on that front. He's approved the pipeline from Canada's tar sands. He's reducing imports. He's lowering energy costs in the US. Meanwhile, here in Australia, is there a kind way to put this? No. Look, when I got here in 2005, Australia had the lowest energy prices in the democratic world, outside of, you know, some Middle East sheikdom. That was only 12 years ago. A dozen years later, we have the highest energy prices in the democratic world. This is crazy. And soon Team Turnbull is going to be considering the Finkel report, which wants to make it even more expensive. So why would you start a business in this country? The highest energy costs in the world, the highest minimum wage in the world. You know, it's crazy. By the way, the average kilowatt hour cost of energy in the US is now under half what it is here. You know, thank God we're all feeling good about saving the planet because energy is so expensive. And it's a third in the US what it is in South Australia, which now has the world's highest energy cost. South Australia, that's it. That's a good investment. But hey, Team Turnbull only wants a 40% renewable target. Doesn't want Labor's 50% one. That's it. That's what voting for the Libs gets you in this country. It gets you 40% instead of 50. You know, for a Trump in Australia. At any rate, I think it's pretty obvious which of those two, Trump or Turnbull, in the energy sector is the deplorable one and which is not. Sixthly, Trump is providing all sorts of aid to non-unionized schools in the US. Charter schools, things like that. Here in Australia, Turnbull signs up the Gonski too. Billions more. No requirement that standards show up. You just go after the Catholics. Now I come from a long line of Scots Presbyterian Calvinists, so in one sense I see the benefit of that. I'm kidding here. But I mean, come on, what is going on here? While school standards continue to tank, we're now below Kazakhstan. You know, I mean, my class the other day where I have fourth year UQ law students who are all OP1s, I asked in passing how many had read Dickens, and usually I get 5 or 6. This year I got 0. Wow. They haven't read a Dickens book. I was going to say, well, that's a tale of two cities, but they wouldn't have gone. Would have been, you know, there's no point in making fun of it. So, you know, it's just great that we're just giving all this money to the teachers' unions. I don't know what Turnbull's doing. Seventhly, Mr. Trump daily attacks the bias of the mainstream media. That's the thing he does. That's his shtick. That's the part I like about Trump. Mr. Turnbull, by contrast, will not appear on Talkback Radio. He will not appear on the Bolt Report. He only appears on left-leaning ABC. Meanwhile, he's appointing lefties to key positions in the ABC. He downplays all claims that there's any bias when it's patently clear there is. So one of those is deplorable and the other isn't. Next, Mr. Trump has created fiscal expectations that have literally added trillions to the stock market value since he was inaugurated. I don't know whether he gets credit for that or not, but that's just what's happened. Since he's taken office, he's torqued up economic growth to more than double what it was at the end of the Obama administration. Mr. Turnbull, meanwhile, has promised to cut, ever so slightly, the tax rate for some businesses, not all of them, by the year 2025, with all the cuts backloaded to the years towards 2025. While he's doing that, he has attacked the superannuation savings of many Australians. If you like Judith Sloan and the Australians, she's very good. She has argued with a lot of detail that we're now, post the Turnbull superannuation reforms, in a position where if you finish with 400,000 in your super, that is exactly equivalent to having $1 million in your super, because the former group will get the age pension with all its concomitant benefits, and the latter will not. So why save more than 400,000? She said, unless you can get up to 1.6 or 7, you might as well throw in the towel at 400,000. How is that for killing incentives and undermining the work ethic? Isn't that what you want from a right-of-center political party? From a government that claims to be liberal? Which one is deplorable there? Now, of course, Trump has said all sorts of stupid things. Some of them, to be fair, are in response to what you can only describe as the most vicious media attacks ever. They are even more one-sided and virulent than those Tony Abbott faced, which is saying a fair bit. But look, conservatives are supposed to be people who look to actions, not words. If you revel in talk and virtue signaling, you should be voting for the Green Party, or maybe the far side of the left. But conservatives look to see actions, and Trump's actions so far look pretty good. I mean, you wouldn't get that from listening to the ABC. I haven't even mentioned yet that Trump's foreign policy looks a lot better when it comes to the Middle East, Iran, and North Korea than Obama's. That said, Trump has his Tony Abbott-like problems with lefties in his own party. I know that, I was an incredibly big critic of Abbott for giving up on 18C, and I know he regrets it. But as it now appears, it's now come out that about 15 people in his own party have threatened to cross the floor. That's no excuse for Abbott. He should have said, go ahead and cross the floor. But it does give new insight into the kind of people who are being pre-selected to the Liberal Party. They are all Labour. What is going on? And Trump has this problem too. A noticeable number of Republicans in Congress, having run for 6 years saying they are going to repeal Obamacare, now make it pretty clear they don't want to. Take Senator John McCain. Last Senate election, which was last year, he ran on the most explicit promise that he would do everything in his power to repeal Obamacare. That's only a year ago. A fortnight ago, when he had the casting vote to keep the repeal alive, so it was his vote would determine what happened, he broke every promise, explicit and implicit, he'd made it under a year ago, and voted not to repeal, or not to continue the process that might lead to repeal. Now that's deplorable. Mind you, that's what 5 Liberal MPs are thinking about with the same-sex marriage. I don't really care about same-sex marriage one way or another, but when a party goes to an election promising X, they have to do X. And it's not good enough to say, oh, well, I want to look inside myself and vote with my conscience. We all want to vote on this issue. So that's something that looks a lot like what the Liberal Party here faces with, the half dozen or more MPs who don't seem to understand. When you promise a plebiscite, then that's what you need to do. If you don't like it, before the last election, they didn't have to run as Liberals. They just knew that was the only way to get into Parliament. So breaching those sort of promises to the electorate, what's the word I'm looking for?
Deplorable.
All right, I'll stop and take questions.
You mentioned about how you didn't want a Bill of Rights instituted in Australia. Was that?
Yeah, I'm a big critic.
Big critic of that. Okay. I was just wondering, how then is it best perhaps then to try and protect free speech? Is that just through our culture and through our actions as citizens, or the more American system where you have a entrenched Bill of Rights which protects speech?
So a Bill of Rights sets out a list of moral entitlements. They all sound good. And then, so non-lawyers tend to think these lists interpret themselves, but they don't interpret themselves. You get real life people interpreting them. And overwhelmingly, judges are not friendly to free speech. So the Americans are an incredible exception, and it's because they've locked in doctrines from the early 1900s, 1930s. When you look at every country that's got a Bill of Rights since the war, anytime there's a conflict between free speech and anything else wins. So there's no strong free speech in Canada. There's no strong free speech in the European Court of Human Rights. If we brought in a free speech entitlement in the Bill of Rights, we would not get American First Amendment jurisprudence. I bet my life on that. We would get, it's the same way that when freedom of religion runs up against equality, the judges always favor equality. You're kidding yourself if you think that freedom of religion is going to win. And basically what a Bill of Rights does, it just takes important social issues and hands them over to a committee of 9 or 7 unelected ex-judges. All ex-lawyers and all with a set of values that really are quite out of line with the overall population. So I just think, in sort of consequentialist terms, they don't work. If you want real sort of protection for free speech, as I do, you're not going to get it out of judges. So then you'd like to get it out of your parliament. Now, Canada's parliament is pusillanimous and weak, but under Stephen Harper, they repealed the equivalent of Section 18C. It took about 25 years. It can happen, but it's not going to happen when the Liberal Party has half the party room and doesn't want it to happen. So you just can't vote for people like that. So I like Julian Leeser, but I would never vote for him for anything. He did not stand up for free. He doesn't believe in getting rid of 18C. Good. Then he should be voted out of Parliament. No exception on that one, yep.
If we had a genuinely conservative government elected...
So this is hypothetical.
Yes, very much.
Speculative now.
What would you do in, let's say, the first 90 days to return some kind of sovereignty to Parliament, get rid of all of these independent bodies that are stacked with
There's
liberals?
way too many of them.
Yeah.
Well, you can't make the mistake that Abbott did and said, we're not going to do any of this. You have to say, I'm not going to promise anything until I get in office and I see where things stand. So then you get berated by the ABC. My own view is that there's got to be 3 things done. I was thinking of doing a Spectator column on this, so bounce on. First is I think that they have to take on the ABC. I mean, it's too big, it dominates everything, and so that's got to be your #1 priority. Cut its funding in half. Pass a law that says every big television show has to have 2 presenters, 1 on each side of politics. They'll try to stack it with Amanda Vanstone types, but it'll be better. It'll be better than nothing. And you could try what Canada did, which worked a bit, is you make the ABC take ads, and if all of your shows are only appealing to the inner city Melbourne kale eating crowd, then you're probably not going to get too many advertising dollars. And it has made the CBC. As the ABC is worse than the CBC, it's worse than the BBC for bias. There was a British journalist came out here and he described he said the ABC makes Britain's BBC look like Fox News. The BBC actually has a few people from the right side of politics. We have nothing, and they get away with it because Mr. Turnbull and Mr. Brandis and whatever, they don't do anything about it. Abbott was starting to do it, but they just screamed up and down and they got rid of him.
Well, actually, I think that Abbott was part of the problem for appointing Turnbull's communications minister.
Yes, that was a terrible error. You should have seen that he was a slimy snake. I mean, I personally, for the first time in my life, I preferenced Labour ahead of Libs at the last election because I figured you might as well take your pain now. And in retrospect, what has Turnbull done to shorten what we've done? Would he have done Gonski? Yes. Would he have thrown more money at renewables? Yes. Everything we've had in the last year and a bit, what it got was shortened. But anyway, I would have liked to. I mean, it's a council of despair, obviously, but it's not a. Politics are dynamic. Everything's in flux. So if Turnbull moves left, it opens up space for Shorten to move left. I can tell you that if Tony Abbott were leader, Mr. Shorten would not be way out in left field. He couldn't possibly be there. He'd be way over. And so the problem is that if you keep Turnbull in, we're just, we're part of the problem. So, I mean, it's bad. I get that. And I mean, he should never have put him in as communications minister. I mean, I think Abbott made a lot of mistakes.
What about, do you think the decentralization of the top powers of government is also a good idea? Like, even fueling somewhat of a Republican kind of movement within Australia? Do you
Well,
think
I'm not a Republican because, I teach constitutional law, and this is not an emotional thing. I don't have pictures of, William up on my wall. I did watch the royal wedding because my wife had it on, and I walked by and I saw Kate's sister, and I thought, I need to sit down and watch a bit of this wedding. I don't want to rule out right off the bat watching this royal wedding. But, look, the problem is we have a Westminster system. And if you try to graft a republic onto a Westminster system, you're creating another power center. It doesn't matter what you say. If you have a president, the president thinks his or her views are worth something. It doesn't matter if it's directly elected, oh, that's worse. But indirectly elected, look at the President of Ireland. And so then we're going to have a House of Reps, we're going to have this crazy Senate, and then we're going to add on top of that a president who has a view. If you think you can't get anything done now, it's going to be terrible. So I'm against a republic based on, what they call in the philosophy of science, the facts. And the problem with the republic is nobody can articulate in advance what their alternative model is. And the reason they can't is there isn't one that works, which is why Shorten now wants to just not tell you what the model is. We'll just vote in the abstract, and then we'll vote on which one. But all the other options are worse. I'm not saying that we have the perfect system. I'm saying you can't give me a system that's better. So normal people, when they're confronted with that, would think, okay, then I'm not going to change. You know, the Westminster system has stood the test. It works pretty well. The only way to sort of recreate it is to say that our president, we're going to throw a dart at the phone book. You know, whatever. For the young people, a phone book is this, it's this hard copy thing, and it's got names in it with landline phone numbers. I know it's a hard concept, but kids don't get that. But assuming you know what a phone book is, throw a dart at the phone book, and whoever you hit, that's going to be your president. Because the beauty of our system is the Governor General has no legitimacy. No Governor General, with the possible exception of the one before this one, who thought she actually could have views. But the whole point of a Governor General is you can't have a view on anything. That's why we don't have to worry about that. Now, that's taken, 400 years to evolve. Nobody would have planned it. But it works great because you appoint someone to be Governor General, and 99 years out of 100, their job is to open hospital wings and cut ribbons, and have a chauffeur, and that's great. You pay them to say nothing. That's great. If you think that an elected president is going to say nothing, you're just, bonkers. And so that you can't recreate that. Now, it's true that once every 100 years, you get a Whitlam-Kerr situation, or in Canada in 1926 there was the Byng affair. But, it's a small price to pay. It hardly ever happens. And when it does, the beauty of a constitutional monarchy is the worst case scenario is somebody calls an election. Ooh, how terrible. I live in a country where the worst case scenario is someone calls an election. It's a great system. But nobody articulates why it's so good, and you can't recreate it with an elected. You'll still stumble along, but we'll get even worse. So I'm against.
James, you had some ideas about how to reform the ABC. What about the universities? How do you reform the universities and the culture there?
Well, I had some hopes that the Libs, when Abbott came in, might do something, but they've done nothing. I would cut all ARC grants that weren't for the hard sciences immediately. So nothing. There's a whole giant bureaucracy. How many people in the social sciences? Well, the social sciences are more contestable. So keep your grants for the hard sciences, even they're politicized. You can see that with climate change. But, medicine, hard sciences, keep your competitive grants. But for things like the social sciences, which are infused with politics, how many people do you think get ARC grants who think that stopping the votes are a good idea? It rhymes with the 5th Roman emperor. Was Nero 5 or 4? 5? I think it was 5. Or anybody who's in favor of traditional marriage, how many grants do they get? Nothing. You can just go through the list. If you're against the Bill of Rights, how many grants? Nothing. What do the Libs do about it? Nothing. They should just shut down the ARC and say, look, it's just going to go to the hard sciences. And if people complain, they go, well, we're going to put all the money into medical grants. Do you prefer the money to go to looking for a cure to, malaria, or some $8 million grant to discovering, which non-binary gender sexual position is better, which they get money for. It's just crazy, some of this stuff liberal governments are funding. I'd start with that, and then I'd go after I'm going to sound like a communist here because I'm a pretty right-wing, pro-market guy, but our VCs who have no market pressures at all are on 1.2, 1.3 million a year. They get paid a lot more than the president of Harvard. They get paid double what the Oxford vice chancellors get. Why? Because a little cozy coterie of people pick their salary. And then they get a whole bureaucracy of DVCs. They're the best paid the managerialism in our universities is insane. I left New Zealand where the law school would vote on things that affected the law school. I haven't had a vote on anything since I've been here. Nothing ever. It's all top down. If you're generous, you might think of it as the sort of 1950s General Motors corporate model, and if you're not generous, you describe it as the East German economic model. It is crazy. They don't do cost-benefit analysis because they're never around to pay the costs. They make these. It's always more regulation, and I call it benefit analysis. If you can look on the horizon and somewhere on the horizon see a plausible benefit, it doesn't matter about the cost because you're not paying the cost, then you impose it. It's insane. And again, they could do something about it. They could. I said the Libs should come in make every university publish the salary of its top 20 people and what they do, you wouldn't find a single person in the classroom. All administrative bureaucrats, over 60% of Australian universities' employees are administrators. Who runs a business? Where 40% produce the wealth or do the job and 60% administer. Oh, Australian universities. There's things you could do. So you should do that. You should make them publish that. You should, you got to start somewhere. They didn't start anywhere. I think based on the fact that I work at an Australian university and I'm obliged to be aware of diversity matters, I'm going to go to you next.
I understand David Morrison, he seems to be a bit more right-leaning.
The general?
I hope you're not talking about the general. You're talking about the guy, my colleague in the law school?
That's right.
Okay, because the general is the guy who doesn't like to go and use God.
Yeah, no.
Australian of the year, crazy man.
as well.
Because when I was in his class, he was making some great calls on Henry VIII, blaming him for the massive extra legislation.
David is certainly right-wing. I would have
Right.
counted him as one of the
three.
5 I think that's it.
Yeah. My uncle was a lecturer at QUT who got into a bit of a biff there as well. And he lays low about it, but the managerialism and corporatism there, it was leading them as well with the international students.
Who all have to be given high marks.
Exactly.
because
That's
they live off
actually
their-
why he quit, because the faculties were demanding he give them marks that they don't necessarily deserve.
Well, probably because they can't speak English.
But I mean, that's an indication to me as well how out of hand it is, and yet they're making these demands from academics.
Look, I mean, I was being facetious about this. Speaking of when your economic model needs all sorts of people to come in, and let's be honest, the best overseas students are not coming to Australia. They're going to the U.S. They're going to Britain because we have big giant classroom sizes. So you can't fail too many of them. And I know from my time that marks have gone up even in law. We don't get too many overseas students in law because it's not it's a professional credential that you can't carry. If you want to practice law, you pretty much have to. There's very few countries where you can take an Australian law degree and go and practice law. Singapore you can, but there aren't many. So we don't feel the worst of it. But marking has definitely marks have inflated. So if you look on a transcript today and you see a 7, it's not the same 7 as you were seeing 15 years ago.
It affects the reputations as well. I mean, I think people are beginning to understand, degrees are becoming less, everyone's got one now, so it's kind of, they're becoming devalued, and it's our academic, I mean, I take pride in the kind of heritage of academia that, our countries have, but if we're not careful, there's the possibility that it could decrease.
Whenever you
to
see
agree,
a thing in the paper that says that one of our universities is in the top 50, I don't believe it.
Yeah.
My basic view is the top 50 universities in the world are Oxford, Cambridge, and 48 American ones. The
Thanks for
studies
feedback.
basically
I'm
have
just curious.
criteria such as
Yeah.
if you hire a Nobel Prize winner, or it's all focused on the hard sciences and aimed at just the natural sciences graduate work. So it doesn't measure undergraduate life here is not very good at all. Sorry, then you were next, and then I think this gentleman, and then
Yeah, that might be the last 3, okay?
It's only 1:15.
Following on from the last question about centralisation, obviously more and more is being done at the federal level of government. How would do you see that as a bad thing, and how would you go about reversing or stopping that?
Well, I definitely am a federalist. Australia's federalism problems are probably now unfixable. I say that personally. The main problem is our High Court, which has the most pro-centre track record over the last 100 years of any court in the federalist democratic world. If you're betting money and it's like states versus the centre, then it's not a 100% track record, but your best course of action is to bet on Canberra winning, even when it's a ridiculous interpretive approach. So work choices. I mean, I like the outcome of work choices, but Howard had to be crazy to do that. And the High Court, there was no head of power to give this to the feds. They'd had 2 referenda, and so they made up a corporation's power that made 2 referenda totally pointless. And anyone with a brain would see, well, if we centralize everything, what's going to happen when we lose power?
Yeah.
Oh, I know. Labor is going to come in and centralize, make it all really left-wing labor relations. If we could go back to the day before work choices, when the states had a lot of the labor, it was a much more deregulated labor relations regime than we have today. And in a lot of ways, that's John Howard's fault. I like John Howard, but he was not a federalist. We have the world's worst vertical fiscal imbalance. We have the only states in the world, in the federalist world, with no income tax power. I don't get why Australians are against federalism. They hear, oh, the states are going to have taxing power, and they think that's bad. It doesn't mean you pay more income tax. It means you pay some directly to the center, and you pay some to the state. So in Canada, if you go to Alberta, there's no income tax. You pay a central tax to the center, to Ottawa. Ontario and Quebec have really high income tax. And you look at the US, California, New York, really high income tax. There's about 12 states that have no income tax, 0. And this is called competition. And what makes a federal system work is that the regions compete against each other. We have this weird view that you have to have the exact same outcome wherever you live in the country. At that point, you can't run a federal system. Cannot. So what happens is that states like Western Australia that encourage mining and they encourage industry, they have to give 70 cents on the dollar to South Australia so they can build a battery that'll last for 6 minutes. It kills all incentive. And so in this country we end up talking about cooperative federalism. It's worthless. It doesn't mean, so we get the worst of both worlds. We've got France's and the UK's one size fits all, except of course the UK now has more federalism than we do, and they're not even a federal system. Scotland has taxing power. I don't get what the problem is with so in this country the states just beg to the center, and they are not accountable for the money. Whereas if you said, okay, what's the top marginal rate, about 49%, 30%, 30 of it will go to the center, and the other 19 will start with the states, and they can raise and lower it as they want. South Australia would then have to fund itself. And believe me, they would lose office pretty quickly. But now, there's no incentive on them to do anything. So federalism, and when you look at the countries in the world that have federal systems, they're wealthier. In the democratic world, they're wealthier, and they have fewer public servants per capita. So the idea that federalism means more layers, more people, this is a typical Australian attitude, it's just factually wrong. If you want tons and tons of bureaucrats, and you want an analogy of a sort of one-size-fits-all regime, just look at any Australian university. There's no competing sources of power, there's just one, and they have more bureaucrats than you can imagine. They just walk. The whole of registry is just there's people running around all over the place, 60% of the employees. So federalism is a great idea, but what's good about it, the two things that are good about it are competition, and it satisfies more preferences. This is the Scalia line from the US. Pick a topic that is contentious, pornography, get away from same-sex marriage. If you imagine in the US that 51% of people have sort of light regulation view of pornography and 49% have a heavier regulation, well, you're basically, if you decide it at the national level, half the country's unhappy. If you delegate it down to the state level, then California and New York can be really loose and the Midwest and the South can be more regulated. And you're not going to satisfy everyone's preferences. There'll be some conservatives living in New York who aren't happy, and there'll be some people in Austin, Texas. But basically, instead of satisfying half the population, you'll satisfy 75% of the population. And how do you do that? By having different answers. So federalism is about difference. If you want the same, then go move to a central system.
I was just wondering your personal experience. I studied at university, I was talking to a law student, and some of them, she was actually saying that they were teaching Marxist philosophy within law. Have you at all experienced that within your field, or somehow this law?
Well, I haven't experienced in the sense of doing it. I haven't done it. Well, actually, that's not true. When I first started teaching in Hong Kong before the handover, we had to do a couple of weeks on sort of Marxism and the law, because it was coming. And so, it's quite quaint when you walk around the campus at UQ. About 2 days a week, you've got the Marxist, Leninist. They set up the same stand every day. I've been there 12 years. Some of the people handing out the flyers, I think they were there in 2005. I don't know where they get their grants from. They're the same people. About 4 years ago, they asked me to come and do a debate against some of these people. I said, well, I'll come if you promise to shower. So they did. But it turned out that I read a lot more Marx than they had, because I had to do it back then. So I think I've read a lot of Marx, and they just don't get how his problem is he's so optimistic about human nature. Wrong. You know, law is not going to wither away, and everything in life is not just about the struggle for resources, and some things are hardwired into us, and, you know, they're just, some of them are just incredibly naive and optimistic. You know, they're nice, but they just, I can remember 4 or 5 years ago when they were all handing out things for, the next utopia is Venezuela. They don't say that anymore. You know, they just forget the facts. But, you know, and then they end up in the Green Party, like Lee Rhiannon.
Now, so in the context of this, I know Corey Bernard from South Australia, but is there a future for the Conservative Party? You know, his Conservative Party in Australia.
Well, if I were trying to map out a future state of events that would help him, I would say that he would want Turnbull to stay in, and he would want the Libs to be annihilated at the next election, which could easily happen, and then the Libs could implode, and, you know, the Conservatives could come up out of the ashes. It happened in Canada when what used to be called the Progressive Conservatives went from a majority of 250-seat House to 2. I'm not making that up, 2. Now, it was the first past the post voting system. It can't happen with ATV, but and the Tories just died, and Stephen Harper started off out west running a party called the Reform Party, and they basically started doing pretty well in the elections. The lefties ran for a while, and they did a reverse engineer takeover of the Conservatives, who were so weak, and then they relabeled it the Conservatives. That sort of thing could happen. I mean, the worst thing that could happen for Bernardi, I suspect, is if they ditch Turnbull and Dutton or Abbott takes over and moves the Liberal, goes out the window. But are there scenarios that, you know, in 15 years the Conservatives could be a major force? Absolutely. But none of them involve good things in the next 3 or 4 years. I mean, I could be wrong, but I just figure that Bernardi really wants Turnbull to stay in place and, you know, keep moving the party left. The more they go left, the more there's an opening on the right. He does have to get ahead of One Nation. You know, can you imagine what would happen if One Nation were led by an articulate, well-educated woman like Marie Le Pen in France? You know, she does miles better than her dad because she's articulate and, you know, handsome. She's just not articulate, and she might actually be asked a question about, you know, vaccinations, and then she's just a moron. But, you know, she's right about some things. There is a problem with immigration. There's no two ways about it. And we ought to be looking at that. We take about, what was I reading? About 4 times as many per capita. This is legal immigration as the Americans. Why are we doing that? You know, and they, you know, one answer is, if you only measure GDP, then you just let 1 million people in, GDP goes up. The only figure that matters is GDP per capita. And in this country, we're not doing very well over the last 15 years. GDP per capita going nowhere.
All right, we might draw it to a close just there. Before we thank James formally, I just want to just clarify a couple of things.
Yep.
The deplorables, when Anthony and I first conceived this, isn't in the sense of being a Trump fan.
No, I had to talk about something, right?
Although they're welcome. The deplorables in our mind is think different. We have a duopoly of thinking that's sort of permeated through society here. It's heading us in a certain direction. If you don't agree with that, you are welcome here. And to think different, discuss ideas that may be dangerous or indeed deplorable. And James has mentioned some of those. LibertyWorks is a not-for-profit organisation who has 2 goals, and the first one is to sort of stand firm and protect our current freedoms. And then after we do that, to then campaign and expand our freedoms. Let's face it, we're all failing miserably and have done for 50 years. We've been heading in the wrong direction for 50 years. We don't have the quick answer to how to change this, but what we're trying to do is gather people together, listen to people that have clarity of thought and intellectual ideas. That
They're next week.
Stimulate thinking and I guess bring us together as a safe haven, because people like James and his occupation and many of you, you're in environments where it's difficult to speak out. So I guess, I hate to use the term, but it's almost like a safe place. I will point out, if you've never been here before, you'll notice that this safe house, or this safe place, this book room, is in the middle of the West End. And I congratulate Anthony Capello for having the brass ones to bring this book room into what is a desolate desolate, left-leaning wasteland where Anthony is a beacon of light, shining brightly, I hope, and brighter eventually. And we're going to support him. If you want to support Anthony, if you want to support us, buy a book, become a member, come to the Deplorables. We have 2 events coming up. We have a number of events coming up. The next couple of events is Dr. Gary Johns will be the next Deplorable speaker. For those of you who don't know Gary, or who doesn't know Gary, but Gary was in the Hawke Keating, a minister in the Hawke Keating government before the Labor Party sprinted away from him. He's now, I think he'd consider himself part of the left-leaning Libs. Well, no, he'd be the right of that, wouldn't he? For that makes him deplorable. And we're looking forward to seeing him. He's on the 5th of September. We also have a fairly large conference coming up on the 14th of October called Liberty Fest. James is speaking there, Gary's speaking there, Latham and Cameron will be coming to town. Sorry?
Wendy.
Yeah, Wendy Francis here from the Australian Christian Lobby will be there. David Pellow's down the end there, he'll be there. There'll be a number of people there. About 20 speakers. Senator Lionhelm, Senator Bernardi may be coming. Ian Plimer, keep going Anthony, I've forgotten. One Nation will be there, Roberts, probably, 99% Hanson. Now, I'm not a fan of some of these people, but you know what? If we're not happy with the direction we're going, we've got to have a look at the alternatives. So the purpose of this festival, this conference, is really to look at the alternatives, get disparate ideas together, discuss, think about what the solutions are, and then hopefully at some point we can execute those. James,
Thank you.
Sincerely thank you for coming along. When Anthony and I were talking about who will be our inaugural Deplorable speaker, I hope you take this as a compliment, but we...
The
fact that you're a royalist because you like looking at Pip's bum, the fact that you're much like Anthony.
I never said bum, actually. You've read that in.
The fact that you're a plain-speaking, right-sided professor in an environment that is also a green left wasteland. You're a beacon of light in the university sector, much like Anthony here is West End. We thank you for speaking out. We thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Ladies
Thanks,
and gentlemen.